You had it right. Dom.
And Johnny.
Yep. Okay, ready? Dom and Johnny in the morning. Hit that timing that time. All right, so we had a few questions from some of our students for this week. So we're just going to jump right into them.
All right.
Because I also think it thematically lines up with kind of the subject matter we've been talking about previously. So the first one, which I really love, is why in Shaolin Kempo Karate do we learn the curriculum in the order that we do? So we kind of talked about that a little bit when we were talking about kicking and why we start with kicking, but just broadly, why do we learn stuff in the order that we do?
I feel like I always start. Do you want to start?
I guess, yeah. Right. So at Shaolin Kempo Karate, you actually learn it in the reverse order. You start with more karate mechanics, then Kempo, then Shaolin. And that has to do with the simplicity in how to transfer power. So what I was taught is a lot of the karate mechanics are very explosive, and it's very simple to be able to get a lot of power. So especially if you're thinking in terms of self-defense, if you start with the assumption that you only have a little bit of time to teach someone how to defend themselves and increase their probability of safety using the tools, you want to give them the things that are going to do the most damage, to give them the best probability. And then if a student, wants to stick around longer, now we get into Kempo, which has more fighting rhythm and pattern fighting. And then if they stick around for the long term, the complexity of Shaolin stuff is going to be able to serve them. But pretty much, palm heel, front kick, wrist release, those I would see as like the have-tos. Everything else is more of a get-to. That's where I think I'd start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the curriculum is then tailored around that. Obviously, the pinions and katas are numbered pretty specifically, but
yeah,
the combinations, I would be willing to bet. I do not, I always like to tout that I'm, a historian in training, but this I actually do not know the answer to.
Yeah.
And that's why the combinations are in the specific order they're in. But if I had to guess,
yeah,
it's that Fred Villari, looked at these combinations that were handed down to him, and he thought about what he wanted to accomplish, with starting with a system that is, very rooted in, block, punch back, kind of that karate explosiveness, and take the combinations that truly reflect those principles, and then move them up. And I think that's why we learn the combinations in the order we learn them. So, and then, it's above 26. Most of those were created by Fred Villari himself. So at that point, I think that's why they start going in order.
Yeah.
Because at that point, he's established where he wants things to go. And this is, once again, I do not know this for a fact. This is my assumption of what happened. But I would say 26 and under, when they're handed to him, I would assume he took a look at them and said, hey, this doesn't make sense to teach first.
Yeah.
Because if I was taught one combination first, I would be like, what is going on?
Right, right.
That's a pretty difficult combination to grasp. At least the principles that Master Villari infused in it. It's very possible that one combination was very different, before it got into Master Villari's hands. So at least the principles we learn now in one combination fit brown belt a lot better than they fit white belt.
Right. So I was told that the reason the combination order isn't sequential, like why 6 combination is 6 combination instead of just labeling it one combination, has to do with number recognition. So if you learn it sequentially, the psychology that Fred Villari was trying to avoid was if he wanted to start talking about 5 combination, he didn't want someone to have to mentally work through 1, 2, 3, 4 before figuring out what 5 was. So if you learned it kind of jumbled up, it makes it a little easier to be able to recall the technique to the number a little bit easier. But like you, I've asked a few times, like, why 1 is 1 and 6 is 6, and I haven't really gotten a clear answer, but I do know that I think John Fritz said that one combination is like the Shotonkwa of the combinations. Like, that has all of the fighting principles that Fred Villari wanted to teach packed into a single technique. There's an argument that there's all 4 ways of fighting in one combination, and that you actually, the point is that the 4 ways of fighting fuse as opposed to thinking of them separately. So a major reap, just that one kind of takedown, there's a fell because you're affecting their balance. There's a kick and a strike because the actual fell is ballistic. And there's grappling because you're wrapping up their arm. So it's like even that one aspect of the combination fuses all 4 ways of fighting together. And that was really, I think, one of his focuses is you don't want to look at these things separately. You want them to overlap and kind of fuse together. What I would be curious of, because now I'm going to get into dangerous waters, last time we talked about Kaju Kenbo, and I've heard that Kaju Kenbo has the alphabet techniques, that there are 26 techniques in Kaju Kenbo because they're 26 letters of the alphabet.
Correct.
I would be curious how they line up.
From my understanding, I've seen the Kaju Kenbo versus Karazempo.
Yeah.
And they're pretty darn different.
Yep.
Yeah. So they are definitely very different. And then the Karazempo, which is more where those 26 combinations kind of got into our system, are a lot more similar. So almost exactly. But you can tell if you watch them, the principles aren't the same.
Yeah.
You could see Fred Villari's influence on them.
Yeah.
Which is important. So, but that blew my mind about one combination. I did not know that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to think on that one. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I wonder if the number order, if there's something to be said about it, like being a priority of principal packages. I know 6, 7, and 3 are kind of the only ones you need, quote unquote. But in terms of unpacking the system, one combination fuses the 4 ways of fighting. 2 combination teaches inside superior position, where you're using half of your body against both halves of theirs, but because of that, you're able to be a little more protected. 3 combination is the opposite. It's all of your body on only half of theirs. And then once we start getting into 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know. But yeah, I would be curious if somebody had like a more in-depth answer to it, or if he literally just threw numbers and techniques in a hat and just drew them. I got nothing on that. Our school in particular, I was just talking about this to a parent yesterday, is also, from my understanding, a little rare in that we also coded the animal techniques as part of the regular rank progression. When I was coming up through the ranks back in the early 2000s, it was basically you kind of learn the animals when you learned them, and by the time you were ready to test for brown belt, you should probably have one of each of them. Since for years we've shifted it, so like at purple belt, you learn the tiger technique as one of your combinations in order to progress to blue belt. And I do think that it's really helpful because I think that the animals, especially understanding the mindset and strategic approaches, even within our system, I think can sometimes be a little undervalued. You have more experience because you've worked at more schools than I have, but this is mostly, my experience is all anecdotal, just from talking to people.
Yeah. This is in no way, shape, or form to bash any other schools.
Not at all. Yeah.
Because I think there's a reason for both schools of thought. However, I do prefer the Mansfield school of thought because, in my opinion, if you're teaching an animal for the sake of teaching an animal, then it's just a Kempo punch technique.
Yeah.
Can
you tell people what a Kempo punch technique is?
This is another gray area. Yeah. Recently, I've heard that there are very specific qualities to create a quote-unquote Kempo.
Which would be?
I don't know.
Oh, you just know that there are qualities, yeah.
I do know that Master Rob Whitney has I think it's like 4 or 5 very specific things that you need to be a Kempo. But I I guess the way I used to, before hearing that, I used to think of a Kempo as just as any technique that was outside of the 108 combinations.
Okay.
And I think that's how a lot of teachers would put their spin on the art. Their take on the art is with animal techniques or Kempos. And I think Kempos are good because I really think it does kind of explore the unique kind of fighting styles of each of the instructors. If you look at how Master Ken moves compared to Master Rob Whitney, even though they had the same teacher, they move very different. So it's very cool, and I think if they both came up with 5 combinations of their own creation, I think those combinations that would be very, very different. Mm-hmm. So that being said, with the animals, I feel like there's only one reason to learn an animal technique, and that's to better understand the animal.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a crane technique and you're really just doing things with your arms open or making cranes' heads or cranes' wings, but there's no actual principle behind it, or it's not there to help teach you how the animal energy works or the tactics of the animal, then in my opinion, it would just be a Kempo. You'd be learning it for the sake of learning it, which not a bad thing. It helps reinforce mechanics. There's a lot of good reasons to have supplemental material. So I'm not bashing anyone who teaches a lot of animal techniques. I don't think that's a bad thing. Just in my opinion, if you're gonna learn a crane technique, you should be teaching kids, things like unbendable arm. Super easy principle to grasp, even though it seems really hard, but doing the unbendable arm drill, if anyone's done it, if any of our listeners have ever done that, it's a very easy drill to teach even children. They grasp it really fast.
Right.
Maybe not the really, really young ones, but especially, older juniors and teens tend to get it. And things like our first crane technique that we learn, where we hop to the left and spread our wings, and now our arms are on that connective tissue. Yeah. Which is a massive principle in crane is, striking with connective tissue. Now you're actually learning the animal. Mm-hmm. The technique itself doesn't matter. Yeah. but what you learn from the technique does. But once I said that's an opinion of my own. Yeah. It's not the answer. It's just my answer.
Well, and just to clarify, because again, I don't want to sound critical. I just think that again, there's a lot of untapped value to it. That doesn't mean that whatever the alternative focus is wrong or unhelpful. So, for example, I feel like one of the benefits to the structure of schools that our system has is a lot of times the school is responsive to the community. So, for example, if you have a school that's near a prison and a lot of your students are prison guards that need to learn to defend themselves in a very specific environment, not really talking about the animals as much and more focusing on practical grappling. And being able to be aware in a tight space that it would make sense that you would focus on that thing instead of away from ours. I just know that we tend to live in a university town. We have a lot of our students are related to or themselves academics. So a lot of the life and mental health benefits of the animals and their mindsets and being able to practice different skill sets for different social situations, that tends to be really, really helpful. And the only reason I say it's undervalued is sometimes when I talk to martial artists that train and haven't been exposed to it, when they are, they're like, oh my goodness, that's so valuable. So it is, I do like how the animals are at least touched on as part of the curriculum, if nothing else, so that they don't get lost. Because one of the things about Shaolin Kempo Karate, it's a double-edged sword. It's a weakness and it's a strength, is that we are a very curriculum heavy style. We have a lot of things that we teach and can delve into. And it's really easy to forget about some of the like really profound lessons because there's so many other things you're trying to focus on.
Yeah, but and I think and I think that's why the animals are important, and I think that's why it's important that they're different.
Yeah,
across the schools, kind of like you were mentioning. I don't necessarily think that the animals are less important because I think even training prison guards.
Yeah,
I am fairly certain that if I put Master Ken in a room and asked to explain to me the difference between how each of the 5 animals would draw a pistol.
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain he would have an answer.
Yeah.
And I bet there is a crane way to draw and a tiger way to draw. It's same with dealing with a prison riot.
Right.
Even the difference between, being confronted by, one very large inmate compared to 3 very large inmates.
Yeah.
So I feel like, the animals can be very beneficial, but you're absolutely right. They have to be tailored. Those techniques have to be tailored to the situation.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely some of them, this is my opinion. It does not reflect anyone else's.
This is a very opinionated podcast.
Yeah, that some of the animal techniques are more practical for fighting with. Some of them are more practical for understanding conditioning and coordination. Like that hopping crane technique you mentioned. I don't think I would trust it for myself, and that's no comment on anybody else's competency in being able to beat somebody up. That would be my fighting technique, right? I think there's a lot of awesome lessons like balance, the footwork into that little hop to the side, the unbendable arm, like you mentioned. I think there's a lot of really beneficial principles packaged in that technique, but like right out of the box, I don't think that'd be one that I'd be like, yeah, that's like my go-to. There are other techniques like what is it? The rotating one where, maybe skip the block, but just being able to willow palm someone in the head, like that is a super helpful practical skill that I could see myself actually like using if I needed to.
Oh yeah.
So it's something to just kind of keep in mind that for me, a lot of the animal techniques are a little more practical or conditioning based, and because of that, like again, to use the prison example, that is you need practicality. You can't be too fancy for that.
Yeah.
But, if you're thinking about cross-training, like you have like an athletic student that does like a lot of different sports, being able to sneak some conditioning in can help them be very much more successful in a still intense but far less intense environment. Yeah. So this, I think it kind of relates to why we learn stuff in the order that we do. Our second question is, why are the time periods that you spend at each rank so different?
Ooh. This actually came up pretty recently. We've been talking about this, especially going through that White to Black series. And when I was having conversations with Master Ken, he was kind of relating it to like a Taekwondo curriculum. Because in Taekwondo, there's significantly less material because they focus predominantly on their legs, even though there are hand things from my understanding, but predominantly your legs become your main weapons. So the path from white to black is shorter, and in return, more Americans tend to flock to Taekwondo. It's actually, I'm pretty sure, the most popular traditional martial art.
Yeah.
In America. And from my understanding, Fred Villari's idea was to make those first couple belts not only build a very strong base and foundation upon which to build the rest of the material, but also something that's pretty easily achievable. So you get that taste of success early on, kind of like you would in a shorter curriculum. And then it gradually starts to get larger and larger and larger, and then you expand upon that. But yeah, that's at least the first few ranks. Then obviously green belt and brown belt are pretty brutal. But yeah, what do you think, John?
I cannot remember which like motivational speaker guy used this example. So if you're listening and you're sitting there being like, it's this guy, just comment. But there was this guy that came in, like it was like a Tony Robbins or someone like that, and he was trying to, from a psychological standpoint, improve the Army's accuracy with rifles. And one of the first things that he found was that if you take the target and you put it like 6 inches from the muzzle of a rifle, and you have the soldier pull the trigger and it just goes right through the hole, that taste of success would drastically improve their performance as the target got farther and farther away. So as opposed to starting them a little too difficult or a little too far away where they're missing a whole bunch, you help them learn what success feels like, so that way they have something positive in the sense of like moving toward as opposed to negative moving away. You're moving toward the repeated success over and over again. So yeah, white belt, we actually have a guideline of generally like after about this many classes, on average, students are probably good for their next rank. It's not something we hold hard and fast to, but it is something there. White belt is like 6 classes. There's really like 4 bullet points you need. 6 and 7 combination are 2 of them, 8 blocks, and then half mooning. And then you give them 2 more classes to kind of practice it. Obviously, some students need a little more. Sometimes, especially if you have a student that's a sibling and has been watching their sibling train, they kind of pick up 6 and 7 a little faster just from watching. So white to yellow is that taste of quick success. And once you've gone through what it feels like to work through a rank, and then you go through the testing process, it lengthens a little bit. But like you said, the purpose of those first few ranks is to help them learn what it feels like to test. And then green belt is where they learn to appreciate testing. So I know something that gets quoted a lot is that in Western society, we need a lot more external motivation to do things. And what's interesting is a conversation I also had recently with Ken is just, and my team actually, why it's good that our green belt class is kind of a little less behaved than our blue belt class. It's not a bad thing. You would want it to be that, the higher in rank that you are, the more behaved you are. And if you're a green belt listening to this, behave. But I think the reason there's like a weird shift is, you're a white belt, you don't really know what the expectations are. You're a yellow and an orange belt, you're a little more comfortable. So, they're a little more willing to act out or whatever. But you still have the belt and the stars to kind of, dangle as a carrot of like, I can't test you if you can't, remember to raise your hand to ask a question or something. So once they hit purple through blue and blue stripe belt, that external motivation has been so well encoded that it's easier for them to figure out the rules. Green belt, you're now switching them over from external to internal motivation because they don't get a belt as often. The fastest I've ever let someone test from green to green stripe was 9 months. And usually it takes a little over a year. So they have to switch motivations, which is why a lot of times they're a little bit more relaxed and they act out a little more often. And we as instructors have to work harder at that rank of, helping them relearn what it means to be a role model student because they don't have something that they get if they do it. They're learning the values of internal motivation. That and a lot of them are hitting, hormonal ages. It's one thing when you're like an 8-year-old. 10 is a very different age, and 11 is a very, very different age. So even though we have to work harder, if we do our jobs right, once they hit green stripe, again, it's kind of like the flip side. It's all right, you've learned the value of internal motivation. Now we're going to test it because there's a lot of things to learn at those ranks. So one of the reasons that the time periods are sometimes different, it has a little bit more to do with the psychology than the curriculum. And especially since our primary student base is kids, I think it's really helpful. Although sometimes it's good for adults. I've had adults get very upset that they weren't ready to test for their next color belt. Not at the moment, but in the past, I've had to have some hard conversations about similar topics. This one I'll kick to you first. So I had one of my newer black belts ask, what really is the difference between martial arts styles? And one of the things she asked is, are they just variations of like some master style, or what is the thing that makes them different?
What a great question. So there's always this kind of metaphor of different martial arts styles being different paths up a mountain. So if you have this, let's say, you're hiking Mount Washington, and there is a ton of different paths to the top, all around the mountain. I assume. I've only ever taken one path of Mount Washington, but let's just use that as an example.
Yeah.
And, maybe from the bottom, you can see the people on the path directly to the right or directly to the left of you. But, further than that, you can't really see anybody on those paths. And then as you start to climb up the mountain and it becomes more narrow at the top, you can start to see people farther in the distance hiking up their path until you reach the summit where everyone has the same view. And that's kind of... And that's a lot like the martial arts, and I think that's why it's such a good metaphor. But, when you're in let's say, Shaolin Kempo Karate, for example, because that's what we train in, we're on one path. And, it's easy to see people, it's easy to have the same view as people, in a very similar style, like another Kempo style, whether it be American Kempo or Kaji Kempo or Karazempo or Nixirio's Kempo. We kind of, especially at the beginning, we all have a very similar view. But it's harder to see people like the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys or the Krav Maga guys. They have a very different perspective, a very different view from their side of the mountain. But as you start getting up, you start to see those spots in the martial arts that blur. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, some of the kicks that the principles and the kicks from Taekwondo, all of a sudden you're starting to see. And that nitty-gritty, fight perspective that you get from something like Krav Maga, you're starting to see. And even the principles that you find in ground fighting, you're starting to see. And the closer you get to the top, the more you realize that we're all on a very similar path. And once you've reached, true mastery, you're all pretty much in the same place. You may move different, but a lot of those principles tend to start overlapping.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's not a perfect metaphor, because you get a master, like a high-ranking master in different styles, and you will notice a lot of differences between them. But I think their perspective is a lot more similar. So that's what I would say. There's definitely a focus at the beginning. So there's different masters believe there are different principles to focus on first, which we just talked about with Fred Villari and what he thought was important first.
Or what I've been told he thought was important first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, to our best knowledge.
Yeah.
But then if you look at a style like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what they think is the most important thing first, and maybe the guard. How to not be hit, when you're in a grappling situation. So you're on the ground. How not to get hit while holding someone in your guard is the most important thing. At least, when I went through, was the most important thing they learned. That was their most important step. Very different from our most important step. So we're at opposite sides. But even as you start to go up in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world, you look at people like Royce Gracie, who is a competent fighter. It's not like he just rolled around on the ground. He was a competent fighter. He was a good striker. He used kicks to get in to grapple people. But you don't see that at the starter level. You start to see that as you go up, and the styles start to, reach this harmonic convergence.
Yeah. This got asked to me in a class, and I said, I think my best answer at the time and right now is just the difference between styles just comes down to priorities. We talked about it when we talked about, traditional, hybrid, and combat sports. Though all three of those have different priorities, and they can be used in different ways. It's just that, your priorities are going to create context for what you're learning. So, for example, combat sport, we've talked before. If you're going to be an MMA fighter, you're training to fight another MMA fighter. You're not training to fight, someone under the influence at a tavern. It's my diplomatic way of saying it. Yeah. That's a very different situation. If you're teaching, women's self-defense, you're not going to sit there talking about the intricacies of a hook kick. You're going to teach how to palm someone in the nose. If you're, one of the things that stood out to me on the black belt test was Master Carpozo mentioning that Master Valari, there's value in like the traditional weapons like, Chinese broadsword and nunchucks and stuff. But really he spent a lot of his time thinking about modern weapons, because if you needed to defend yourself, that would be the thing that you'd actually have to defend yourself against, like a firearm or a knife.
The monkey wrench defense.
Yeah. So, and I think that you're absolutely right. There are universal principles that different martial arts borrow from, and the higher you get in rank, the more you start to, it becomes more obvious where those, where the overlaps are. But also, like you said, I don't think it's perfect. I think that you're just prioritizing based on the context of what you're actually training for. Traditional martial arts, super excellent for conditioning, and just making sure that you're able to live, long and healthy and stuff. Definitely also has self-defense application. And that self-defense application is going to look different than MMA. It's just that the priorities and the methodologies are a little different. Even in our system, one of the forms you learn in the, I don't know when other schools learn, we learn it at second and third degree black belts, but Ningley North and Ningley South, one of them was a form where the environmental assumption is that you're more sure-footed, that you're able to kick higher and rotate in a different way because you're operating on like a mountain path versus like the docks or a bog or something, where your surfaces are a lot narrower and they might even be like slipperier, so you can't trust your footwork the same way as you can in North. So that's just like a pocket example in our style about how the context that you're learning it in is specific, so you're training a specific skill set. So as someone who's looked at a lot of different styles, if you had to sum up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what's like the situational context? I know that it's kind of an unfair question because there's a lot, but what are you really training for when you do? Because you even mentioned, there's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for combat sport. You want to do more tournament stuff. Versus, from my understanding, the Gracie stuff is a lot more like practical self-defense.
Yeah. And even on the Gracie side, there's a lot of different, there's Hoist Gracie schools and Gracie Baja schools, and but most like pure Gracie schools, like that kind of stick to the heart of it.
Yep.
It's self-preservance. Preservation.
Yeah.
Thank you. I need coffee. Self-preservation. It's keeping yourself safe. It is making sure if someone's on top of you that you're not getting hit and you can get up and get away safely. So, a lot of times the thought of bringing someone onto the ground into your guard is not, what, especially my teachers, one of my teachers, Jeremiah, who was awesome, he would talk about that all the time. He would never pull guard. pull someone down on top of them on purpose.
Right.
You know, and he said, why would I do that? You know, especially, you know, in a real life scenario, there's no mats, you know, it's concrete or, you know, who knows. The point is to get up, not to go down. I'd be fairly certain to say it's probably the easiest martial art to learn how to not get hit the fastest.
Yeah.
You know, it is and it's why you see people who after only a couple classes adequately defend themselves in the street, you know, just because it is, you do so much drilling and it is so easy to quickly apply. A lot easier than developing a really strong punch. So I would say that's its core.
Yeah.
Is self-perseverance. I keep saying preservation.
Yeah.
I think I'm like mixing perseverance
and
preservation. So self-preservation, getting off the ground, getting away safely.
Yeah, so how much time do you spend on your feet? Because if the goal is to get back up on your feet, that doesn't necessarily mean you're in the best place to get away right away.
So at least with the Gracie universities, they're usually split into two pieces. They have the stand-up and then the ground.
Okay, yeah.
So the first thing you'll learn is a stand-up skill.
Yeah.
And you'll spend like 10 or 15 minutes on that before you move to the ground. And the stand-up skills are great. You know, it's like someone's coming for a dive tackle.
Right.
And, you know, you're sprawling and then getting them in a guillotine.
Yeah.
You know, so things like that. Or there are some takedowns. There's a rear takedown. You learn haymaker defense.
Yep.
So all that stuff that's standing.
Yeah, it sounds like about half.
Yeah.
Yeah, from that university perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More of the class time is spent on the ground.
Right.
But that portion in the beginning is usually spent upwards. Then on the ground, depending on the technique, you know, they're obviously if we're working on submissions, then you're submitting on the ground usually.
Yeah.
You know, like whether it be an armbar or Americana or Kimura. But then there's, you know, other techniques where the goal is to get on your feet.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is usually what I would opt to do.
Yeah.
You know, I want to get up and I want to get out.
Yeah.
And most of my teachers felt the same way.
Yeah, well, and that just makes a lot of sense because I know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is kind of famous for its ground grappling, and it would make sense where if the standing skills aren't as complex, they don't require as much instruction, that when you're actually, you know, in a class, you would spend more time on the ground because that's where the coordination is probably a little less intuitive. Whereas if it's intuitive, you just have to reinforce it. It's not like you have to rewire your nervous system to learn the new skill. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and they're grappling from the standpoint of being able to grapple other grapplers too.
Yeah.
Because I mean, a white belt that has, you know, been training for, you know, even just 1 month, you know, coming to a few classes a week, you know, will wipe the floor with anybody who doesn't train.
Yeah.
Like it's incredible how fast it happens, just because you're in a situation where you are almost predominantly controlled sparring the whole time.
Yeah.
So you can't, you know, if you were just on the ground by yourself trying to, you know, shadow grapple.
Right.
It'd be a little ridiculous. You know, and sometimes I've seen my instructors do it where they have us do it on the ground so that you can feel your hip arcing in a certain way, you know, before you do it on a body. But for the most part, you're always on a body.
Yeah.
And when you're always on a body, it is very, very easy. The reason we don't do that in Shaolin Kempo is because if we repeatedly punched our partner in the face, it would be a very different experience.
Right.
You know, grappling is just one of those things that you can do controlled without hurting your partner while still being effective.
Dom and Johnny in the morning.